The room was built on certainty, not the kind that is questioned, but the kind that is repeated so often it begins to feel permanent, a place where belief was not something people explored, but something they stood upon, something that supported everything else they said, everything else they thought. And that is what made the tension in the room so unusual, because tension does not belong in spaces where answers are already assumed to exist. It belongs where doubt has begun to form, and doubt had already ended long before the man himself spoke, moving quietly through conversations, appearing in pauses, in the way people hesitated just slightly longer than usual before expressing what they claimed to believe. And at the center of that shift stood Friedrich Nietzsche, not elevated, not demanding attention, but impossible to ignore, because he carried something that did not align with the structure around him, something that did not seek agreement. And when a man does not seek agreement, he becomes a disruption, even before he speaks. And the people in the room felt it, not clearly, not consciously, but enough to create discomfort, and discomfort, when it cannot be explained, often turns into resistance, and resistance seeks expression, and that expression came in the form of a question, sharp, direct, and filled with something more than curiosity, asking what Nietzsche meant when he said that God was dead. And the moment the words were spoken, everything narrowed, because this was no longer a general discussion. It was a confrontation, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched, not uncertain, but controlled, because silence before an answer is not emptiness. It prepares what follows. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm for the weight of what he was about to say. And he said that God is dead is not a declaration. It is a diagnosis. And the words did not explode, they settled. And in settling, they became heavier, because they did not attack belief directly. They questioned its foundation, and the room reacted not loudly, but internally, because the mind does not reject something immediately when it does not yet fully understand it. It pauses, and that pause is where discomfort begins. And one of the men spoke again, more urgently now, asking how such a thing could be true, asking how something so absolute could simply disappear. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that God did not die because something happened to him, but because something happened to people, because belief had begun to fade long before anyone admitted it, because people had already started living as if God were no longer present. And the words shifted the direction of the moment, because now the argument was no longer about God. It was about the people themselves, about the distance between what they claimed to believe and how they actually lived. And that distance is where tension grows, and once it is seen, it cannot easily be ignored. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, as if the words had not been rejected but absorbed. And absorption is far more dangerous than opposition, because it allows an idea to move inward, to settle where it cannot be easily removed. And the people in the room felt it, even if they resisted it, because something had been exposed that they could not easily deny, the gap between belief and reality. And when that gap becomes visible, it creates discomfort, because it forces a question that most people spend their lives avoiding, whether they truly believe what they claim to believe, or whether belief has simply become a habit, something repeated so often that it no longer requires examination. And once that question appears, it does not remain theoretical, it becomes personal. And the moment something becomes personal, it becomes far more difficult to control, because it is no longer about defending an idea, it is about defending oneself. And that is where tension deepens, because people do not easily separate their beliefs and their identity. And when belief is challenged, identity begins to feel unstable, and instability is something the mind resists immediately, even before it fully understands what is happening. And one of the men stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, carrying urgency, asking whether Nietzsche meant that everything they had built their lives on was nothing more than illusion, whether all of their certainty, all of their structure, all of their belief had no real foundation. And the question carried anger, but beneath that anger there was something else, something less visible but far more important, something closer to fear, because anger often emerges when something essential begins to feel unstable, and instability, when it reaches a certain point, cannot be ignored. And Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, his tone unchanged, as if the intensity around him did not belong to him at all, saying that the danger is not that God is dead, but that people no longer know what replaces him. And that line shifted the moment again, because now the focus was no longer on loss, but on consequence. And consequence is far more difficult to face, because loss can be denied, it can be resisted, it can be reinterpreted, but consequence demands response. It demands action, and most importantly, it demands responsibility, and responsibility is something many people try to avoid, especially when it cannot be transferred to something beyond themselves. And Nietzsche continued, saying that for generations, people had relied on something external to define what is right, what is wrong, what has meaning, and what does not. And that reliance created stability, but it also created dependence. And dependence, once removed, leaves something far more difficult to face, the necessity to decide for oneself. And the room reacted to that not outwardly, but inwardly, because now each person had been drawn into the argument, not as an observer, but as a participant, and participation removes distance. And without distance, resistance becomes harder to maintain, and hesitation began to spread slowly, quietly, because hesitation weakens certainty. And once certainty begins to weaken, something else takes its place, something less defined, something more difficult to control. And Nietzsche, seeing this, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the moment did not require force. It required space, and space had already begun to open. And within that space, something unfamiliar was forming, not agreement, not rejection, but awareness. And awareness is far more dangerous than either, because it does not disappear once it is recognized, and it cannot be easily undone once it begins. And Nietzsche continued, saying that meaning, for most people, is not something they discover, but something they inherit, something they accept without questioning, because questioning would require facing something far more difficult, the possibility that nothing exists beyond what they are willing to create themselves. And the words settled deeper now, because they removed something without replacing it with something equally stable. And when something is removed without immediate replacement, it creates a void, and a void is something people instinctively fear, because it offers no guidance, no direction, no reassurance. And the people in the room felt that void beginning to form, not as a clear realization, but as discomfort, something difficult to define, something that did not align with what they had always believed, and yet could not be easily dismissed. And the room, once filled with certainty, now held something entirely different, something unstable, something unresolved, something that no longer responded to simple answers. And within that shift, something had already begun to change, even if no one was ready to admit it, because what they were feeling was not confusion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet fracture in certainty itself. And for the first time, the room was no longer certain, but it had not yet understood what that uncertainty meant. The room did not collapse. It held. But what remained was not stability. It was something far more dangerous. What they were feeling was not confusion. It was a beginning of something far worse, because uncertainty does not stay where it appears. It spreads, quietly, inwardly, without permission, and once it takes hold, it does not leave easily. The room no longer felt stable, not because anything visible had changed, but because something within it had begun to dissolve, something that had once held everything together without effort. And what replaced it was not chaos, but emptiness. And emptiness is far more difficult to face, because it offers no answers, no structure, no direction. And the people in the room felt it, even if they could not explain it, because something had been taken from them, without being physically removed, something they had always relied on without fully realizing it. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood within that space, not as someone who had taken anything, but as someone who had revealed his absence. And revealing absence is far more unsettling than destroying presence, because it leaves nothing to argue against, only something to confront. And one of the men spoke again, his voice quieter now, asking what remains if God is truly gone. And the question carried something new, not resistance, but fear. And fear is always more honest than certainty. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that what remains is responsibility, the responsibility to create meaning, to define values, to determine what is right and wrong, without relying on something beyond themselves. And the words did not comfort, they deepened the tension, because responsibility is heavier than belief, and most people prefer belief because it removes that weight. And the room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was not waiting, it was confronting, because now each person had been left alone with something they could not easily escape. And Nietzsche spoke once more, saying that the real danger is not that God is dead, but that people will continue living as if he were alive, avoiding the responsibility that comes with his absence. And the words settled with finality, and no one responded, because nothing could restore what had been there before, and Nietzsche turned and walked away, leaving behind not silence, but something far more unsettling, the realization that the world had already changed, and that they had changed with it. The room did not collapse. It held. But what remained was not stability. It was something far more dangerous. What they were feeling was not confusion. It was a beginning of something far worse. Because uncertainty does not stay where it appears. It spreads, quietly, inwardly, without permission. And once it takes hold, it does not leave easily.